Picture a general sitting at a desk in Washington in the fall of 1924, writing a classified report that will run to 324 pages by the time he sets down his pen. The report describes a Japanese air attack on Pearl Harbor. It specifies Sunday morning. It specifies the early hours before the base has fully woken. It names the targets in sequence. He submits it to the War Department. They file it. The man who prosecutes him at his court-martial the following year is still alive on December 7, 1941, and the report is still in the filing cabinet. The war that ended in November 1918 killed approximately 17 million people. When it was over, the institution that had fought it came home and began planning for the next one, organized around roughly the same assumptions it had carried into the first. Infantry to take ground. Artillery to prepare the advance.
The Navy's capital ships controlling the sea lanes, as they had since the Spanish-American War. The airplane, which had proved useful over the Western Front, belonged in a supporting role. That word, supporting, is where Mitchell's problem started. Not supporting as in useful, supporting as in secondary, dependent. An instrument in service of the arms that actually mattered. Mitchell had commanded American air forces in France. He had been at the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the largest military operation in American history at that point. 1.5 million American soldiers moving through German lines, and Mitchell watching from the air. Watching what aircraft could do when properly concentrated, and what they couldn't do when commanders treated them as an afterthought to the infantry below. He came back from France with a conclusion that he found impossible to set aside. The airplane was not a supporting arm. It was a weapon system capable of doing something no surface force had yet managed, reaching past an enemy's defenses and destroying what he depended on to keep fighting. Factories, supply depots, the ships that controlled the water between armies. The Navy's capital ships, specifically. Mitchell's thesis was precise. The battleship was finished, not weakening. Finished. A $50,000 biplane carrying a 500-pound bomb could do to a 27,000-ton warship what years of naval gunfire at sea had never achieved. The Navy read this claim the way any institution reads a claim that contradicts the foundation of its existence. They found it unpersuasive. This is worth sitting with, because their position wasn't empty. Battleship armor had been engineered specifically to resist naval gunfire, the most concentrated destructive force anyone had put to sea. Decades of naval architecture had gone into calculating exact steel thickness, plate angle, compartmentalization, the relationship between armor depth and penetrating power at various ranges. A bomb dropped from altitude arrived from a different vector than a naval shell, at different velocity, without the same penetrating mass. Whether it could punch through that armor and reach something vital was, in 1920, a genuinely open technical question. The Navy believed the answer was no. Their engineers had reasons. Mitchell believed they were about to be proven wrong in public. If you've never heard this story, and most people haven't, even people who know Pearl Harbor, share it with someone who should. The only reason history like this disappears is that no one passes it on. In the summer of 1921, after months of public argument and limited congressional support, the War Department authorized a test. The target was the SMS Ostfriesland, a captured German dreadnought of 27,000 tons that had survived the Battle of Jutland in 1916, absorbed damage that would have finished lesser ships, and remained afloat. The Navy entered their formal position into the record before the test began. She could not be sunk from the air. If it proved somehow possible, the minimum time required was 48 hours. Congress watched from boats offshore. Mitchell arrived with a different number in his head. On September 12, 1921, over the Chesapeake Bay, one of those numbers was going to be wrong. And whoever held the wrong one was going to have to explain it to the people in the boats. The rules of the test had been negotiated in advance, which is itself a thing worth noting. The Navy insisted on intervals between bombing runs, Time for their inspectors to board the ship, assess damage, determine whether she was still seaworthy, report back. The logic was professional. They wanted a controlled scientific evaluation, not a demonstration. The distinction mattered to them. A demonstration proved a point. An evaluation produced data. Mitchell accepted the terms. He also arrived with bombs heavier than the agreed specifications, a decision that would generate formal protest from the naval observers before the day was finished, and that Mitchell, characteristically, did not apologize for. September 12, 1921, Chesapeake Bay. Congress watching from boats offshore. The SMS Ostfriesland sat at anchor in calm water. 27,000 tons of German naval engineering, built to withstand the punishment of a fleet engagement and still fight. She had absorbed damage at Jutland that would have killed most ships, absorbed it, and returned to port under her own power. The Navy's engineers had studied her specifications and reached their conclusion. She could not be sunk from the air. If it proved somehow possible, 48 hours was the minimum. Mitchell's aircraft arrived. 21 minutes later, the Ostfriesland was on the ocean floor. Think about that for a second. The Navy had said 48 hours. Mitchell needed 21 minutes. The naval observers on the water didn't cheer. According to accounts from the demonstration, several were visibly shaken, not by the spectacle, but by the implication. Rear Admiral William Sims, who had spent years arguing for reform within the Navy's own institutional structure, watched the ship go down and said afterward, according to his documented correspondence, that it was the most significant naval demonstration he had ever witnessed. He was one of the few senior naval officers who said so publicly. Most did not. What the Navy said publicly was that the test had been conducted unfairly. The bombs were too heavy. The intervals had been violated. The Ostfriesland had been stationary, undefended, unable to maneuver. Nothing like the conditions of an actual engagement. Their complaints were not entirely without merit. A warship underway, firing its anti-aircraft guns, presenting a moving target, is a meaningfully different problem than a stationary hulk in calm water. Mitchell knew this. He had not claimed otherwise. What he had claimed was simpler, that aircraft could sink a battleship. The Ostfriesland was on the bottom of the Chesapeake Bay. The claim had been tested. The Navy filed formal protests about the test conditions and began planning the next argument. Mitchell's response to the demonstration is documented in his writings from this period. He did not describe triumph. What he described was closer to professional confirmation, the specific satisfaction of a man whose calculation had returned the expected result. In his 1925 book, Winged Defense, he wrote about airpower's capacity to reach past naval defenses with a clarity that reads, in retrospect, less like advocacy than like instruction. This is the thing the institution failed to register in time. He wasn't performing a theory. He was describing a methodology. The Ostfriesland wasn't an argument. It was a demonstration of a process that would work again, on different ships, in different oceans, whether the Navy accepted it or not. The question Mitchell was working with was never whether aircraft could sink ships. After September 12th, that was settled. The question was what came next. Who would build the aircraft, train the crews, develop the doctrine, integrate air power into American strategic thinking before someone else did it to America instead? He knew the answer had a deadline. He had been counting toward it since France. Someone else was counting too. In the years following the Ostfriesland demonstration, Japanese naval planners began studying the public record of American air power development with focused professional attention. Mitchell's writings circulated. The results of the 1921 test were analyzed. Gordon Prange's research, documented in At Dawn We Slept, establishes that Japanese naval officers, including those who would later contribute to planning at Pearl Harbor, were tracking the development of American air power doctrine through open-source material during precisely the years Mitchell was arguing for it in Washington. The institution that was publicly dismissing Mitchell's ideas was not the only institution reading them. He was winning arguments in the wrong capital. And in Washington,
The men who had watched the Ostfriesland go down in 21 minutes were now quietly working on a different calculation. Not about airpower, but about Mitchell himself. About how much of this they could tolerate before it became a problem that required a more permanent solution. They had 4 years before they found one. If this is the history you want more of, subscribe. One story like this every week. By 1922, Mitchell had been making the same argument for 3 years. He'd made it in congressional testimony. He'd made it in the press. More than any serving general before him had used the press, which the institution noted and did not appreciate. He'd made it in formal reports submitted through proper channels, which were read, acknowledged, and placed in the appropriate files. He'd made it with the Ostfriesland, which was now 120 feet underwater and still not persuading anyone who hadn't already been persuaded. The argument wasn't getting quieter. Washington was getting louder. In this period, 1922 through 1924, something shifted in Mitchell's approach.
The public campaign continued, but alongside it, working in the specific register of classified military reporting rather than congressional theater, he began assembling something different. Not an argument, a document. 324 pages. That number is worth sitting with before we discuss what's inside. 324 pages is not a memo. It is not a position paper. It is the product of methodical, sustained analytical work, the kind that requires a man to organize everything he knows about an adversary's capabilities, everything he knows about his own country's vulnerabilities, and work through the implications without allowing his conclusions to get ahead of his evidence. Mitchell submitted it to the War Department in 1924. The methodology behind it was straightforward and, in retrospect, models the exact kind of thinking that intelligence work is supposed to produce and rarely does. He wasn't speculating, he was reading. He read Japanese naval doctrine, available in open-source publications and translated materials, and identified what Japan needed to accomplish in the Pacific to secure its strategic position. He read the geography of the Pacific and identified where American forces would need to be positioned to counter Japanese expansion. He read the specifications of Japanese aircraft and calculated what missions they could execute from what distances. He read the schedule of life at Pearl Harbor, how the base operated, when the fleet was typically in port, how the morning watch functioned, and identified when, of all the possible hours in a week, the base would be most vulnerable to an air attack arriving without warning. The answer was Sunday morning, early, before the base had come fully awake. He described the approach routes the attacking aircraft would use. He described the sequence of targets, battleships first, then the airfields to prevent a counterattack, then the fuel storage. He described what a carrier-based strike package of this nature would look like in terms of aircraft numbers and attack profiles. This was not prophecy. It was operational analysis. He read what Japan could do, read what America had left undefended, and described the point where those two things would eventually intersect. He submitted 324 pages of it to the War Department and waited. The War Department's response, as best as the documentary record shows, was to file it, not to dispute it, not to commission a counter-analysis, not to convene a planning session about the vulnerabilities Mitchell had spent 324 pages describing in operational detail. To file it, which in institutional terms meant it had been received, processed, and placed in the category of things that had been received and processed. Mitchell, by this point, understood what filing meant. He had watched the Ostfriesland demonstration produce a formal protest rather than a doctrinal review. He had watched 3 years of congressional testimony produce committee reports that acknowledged his arguments and generated no policy change. He had watched the institution develop a reliable mechanism for receiving uncomfortable information. Intake, acknowledge, redirect, store. The filing cabinet was the institution's most effective weapon. It never argued back. It never required a rebuttal. It simply made things disappear into a room where they continued to exist without disturbing anyone. What Mitchell probably understood, writing those 324 pages in the knowledge of what would happen to them, is harder to determine. His documented writings from this period, his testimony, his articles, winged defense, show a man who had stopped trying to persuade and started trying to establish a record. The public argument was becoming less about changing minds and more about ensuring that when the minds eventually changed, and he believed they would, there would be documentation of what had been known, by whom, and when. He was writing for a reader who didn't exist yet. The War Department filed his report. Filed it in the specific institutional sense of having received it and placed it where received things go. A cabinet, a room, a building 17 miles from the desk where it was written. 324 pages describing a Sunday morning in Hawaii, specific targets, early hours before the base came awake. This report seemed like one man's obsession at the time. It was not. On September 3, 1925, the USS Shenandoah broke apart over Ohio. The Shenandoah was a Navy dirigible, a lighter-than-air craft that the service had been developing as a long-range reconnaissance platform. She flew into a storm system over the Midwest that the crew had tried to avoid and couldn't. The structure failed. She came apart in the air. 14 men died, some of them falling from the wreckage as it descended. The Navy released a statement about weather conditions and the inherent risks of airship operations. They were not wrong that the weather had been severe. They were also not wrong that dirigible operations carried risks that heavier-than-air aircraft didn't. Mitchell released a statement of his own. He had been watching the institution manage the implications of air power for 6 years, watching it absorb the Ostfriesland and produce a protest, absorb 3 years of testimony and produce committee reports, absorb 324 pages of operational analysis and produce a filing cabinet. He had been making the professional argument and the public argument and the classified argument, and none of them had moved the institution in any direction that mattered. The Shenandoah gave him a different kind of opening. Not a demonstration, a failure. 14 men dead, and the institution already preparing the explanation that would prevent the failure from requiring any change. He issued a public statement accusing the War and Navy departments of, in his documented words, incompetency, criminal negligence, and almost treasonable administration of national defense. He knew exactly what that sentence would do. The court-martial opened on October 28, 1925, in Washington. Mitchell was charged with conduct prejudicial to good order and military discipline, a charge specific enough to be prosecutable and broad enough to encompass nearly any statement a serving officer might make that the institution found inconvenient. The proceedings were public, which Mitchell had not fought. He understood that a closed proceeding would produce the same result with less documentation, and he had been building a record for years. 14 officers served as judges. One of them was Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur's role at the court-martial is documented in his memoir, Reminiscences, where he described the proceedings as one of the most distasteful experiences of his career. He wrote that he believed Mitchell's intentions had been sincere, that the general was motivated by genuine concern for American air power rather than personal ambition. In Reminiscences, MacArthur stated that he did not wish to vote for conviction. He voted for conviction. 13 of the 14 judges did. MacArthur's account of his own position at the court-martial deserves to be read carefully. He describes genuine discomfort with the verdict. He does not describe having argued against it. The discomfort was real. The vote was what it was. These are not contradictory facts. They are the same fact, seen from two angles that both need to be in the frame. The prosecution's case was not complicated, because it didn't need to be. Mitchell had made the statement. The statement was public. The statement accused senior officers by name and institution of negligence that had cost American lives. Under the Articles of War as they existed in 1925, none of that required much elaboration to establish the charge. The prosecution didn't need to prove Mitchell wrong about air power. They needed to prove he had said what he said in the manner in which he had said it. Both were simple. Mitchell's defense rested on the same argument he had been making for 6 years, that the institution's handling of military aviation had demonstrably cost lives and would cost more, that the public had a right to know this, and that an officer's obligation to the people his army was supposed to protect sometimes ran deeper than his obligation to protect the institution from embarrassment. This was not a legal defense. It was a philosophical position. As a legal defense in a military court operating under military law, it was insufficient. Mitchell understood this. He had understood it before the proceedings opened. What he was doing in the courtroom was the same thing he had done in the report, building a record, establishing, in a forum more durable than a congressional hearing or a press statement, what he had known, what he had argued, and what the institution had chosen to do with it. 324 pages sat in a filing cabinet 17 miles away. The prosecution did not address them. On December 17, 1925, the court returned its verdict. Guilty on all counts. The sentence was suspension from rank, command, and duty for 5 years, with forfeiture of pay. President Coolidge reduced the financial penalty, which was something. Mitchell submitted his resignation on February 1, 1926. It was accepted. He was 46 years old. He had spent 24 years in the Army, commanded American air forces in the largest military operation his country had undertaken, sunk a battleship in 21 minutes in front of Congress, submitted 324 pages of operational analysis describing in specific detail what an adversary was going to do to an American base, and been removed from the institution that would either prepare for that attack or not. He was now a civilian. The filing cabinet remained where it was. Washington had finished counting. Mitchell had stopped. What he carried out of that courtroom wasn't bitterness, or if it was, his documented writings from the period following his resignation don't read that way. What they read like is the specific exhaustion of a man who has run the same argument past every available institutional mechanism and watched each one process it and redirect it and store it somewhere out of sight. He had 4 options left. He could recant. He could disappear. He could keep arguing from outside the institution, which he did, in lectures and writings and public appearances, with diminishing access to the audiences that mattered. Or he could wait. He had, according to his own analysis, roughly 15 years before the filing cabinet proved him right. He was wrong about the number. He had 10. Mitchell died on January 19, 1936. Influenza, complicated by heart disease. He was 56 years old. He died in New York, 10 years after his resignation, having spent those years writing and lecturing about airpower to civilian audiences with the specific persistence of a man who had run out of official channels and kept going anyway. His later writings are less polished than Winged Defense. The access was smaller, the platforms less significant, the institutional audience he had spent his career trying to reach no longer available to him. He did not live to see what he had been describing for 15 years. He died 5 years and 329 days before Pearl Harbor. The 5 years between his death and December 7, 1941, passed inside the institution without significant change to the things Mitchell had identified as vulnerabilities. The Pacific Fleet remained based at Pearl Harbor. The base operated on its established schedule. The Army and Navy commands in Hawaii had a working relationship that was, by most documented accounts, characterized by the specific mutual wariness of 2 services sharing a small island and a budget. The airfields at Hickam and Wheeler were arranged in neat rows that made them easy to service and easy to target. The radar installation on the northern shore of Oahu was new, operational only since the summer of 1941, and its operators were still learning what it could and couldn't do. The filing cabinet in Washington, where Mitchell's report had been placed in 1924, still existed. The report was still inside it. On the morning of December 7, 1941, 353 Japanese aircraft arrived over Oahu in 2 waves. The first wave crossed the northern coast at 6 minutes before 8 o'clock in the morning. It was a Sunday. The attack struck Battleship Row first. 8 American battleships moored in the harbor, the primary target of the strike package. It struck the airfields at Hickam and Wheeler, destroying aircraft on the ground before they could get airborne. It struck the fuel storage facilities, though less effectively than the planners had hoped, a gap in the execution that would matter more than the attackers understood at the time. By 9:45 in the morning, the second wave had withdrawn. 2,403 Americans were dead. 8 battleships had been damaged or sunk. The Pacific Fleet's striking capacity had been removed from the board for months. Now go back to a desk in Washington in the fall of 1924. A general is writing a classified report that will run to 324 pages before he sets down his pen. He describes a Japanese air attack on Pearl Harbor. He specifies Sunday morning. He specifies the early hours before the base has come fully awake. He names the targets in sequence, the battleships first, then the airfields to prevent a counterattack. That report is still in the filing cabinet on the morning of December 7, 1941. The man who wrote it is 5 years in the ground. The attack is unfolding almost exactly as he described it. The alignment between Mitchell's 1924 report and the events of December 7th is documented, not as prophecy because it was never prophecy, but as operational analysis that proved accurate to a degree that had no good institutional explanation beyond the fact that he had done the work and the institution had filed it. He had read Japanese capabilities. He had read American vulnerabilities. He had identified the intersection point and described it in the specific language of an officer who expected his document to generate a response. Sunday morning, early hours. Battleships first, airfields second. December 7th came in on a Sunday. At 6 minutes before 8 in the morning, the battleships were first. No editorial comment is necessary here. The facts sit next to each other, and the distance between them is whatever it is. The viewer can measure it. Major Allen Gullion had served as the judge advocate who prosecuted Mitchell at the 1925 court-martial. By December of 1941, Gullion was the Provost Marshal General of the United States Army, a senior position in Washington, inside the institution whose administration Mitchell had publicly accused of criminal negligence 16 years earlier. He was in Washington when the news from Pearl Harbor arrived on December 7th. Whether he thought about the filing cabinet is not documented. Whether anyone went to look at the report on December 8th is, according to available sources, not established with the precision that would allow a confident statement. It is frequently asserted in secondary accounts. The primary record on this specific point is less clear than the assertion. What is clear is that the report existed. The attack had happened. The gap between them was 17 years, 324 pages, and 1 court-martial verdict. The institution that had filed the report was now at war with the country the report had described. Mitchell had calculated, from what he knew of Japanese intentions and American vulnerabilities, that the attack he was describing was a matter of when, not if. He had been asking the institution to act on that calculation since 1922. He had made the argument publicly and in classified channels and in 324 pages of documented operational analysis. He had been court-martialed for making it too loudly. He had been right. This is the part that doesn't resolve cleanly, the part that sits with you after the dates and the aircraft numbers and the body count have settled into the record. Not that he was right. Being right is common enough, in retrospect, once the thing predicted has happened. What doesn't resolve is the specific arithmetic of what being right had cost. 2,403 Americans dead on December 7th. 5 years since Mitchell had. 17 years since he'd described exactly this. The count, in the end, was not the one Washington had been keeping. On April 18, 1942, 16 Army bombers lifted off the deck of USS Hornet and flew toward Tokyo. The aircraft were B-25 Mitchells. The naming had happened in 1941, before Pearl Harbor, before the Doolittle Raid, before anyone outside a small circle of military planners knew the B-25 would be used to put bombs on the Japanese capital 4 months after the attack Mitchell had described in 1924. The aircraft had been named for him because people who knew the history of American air power knew whose thinking had made it possible. The raid that would carry his name over Tokyo happened on the watch of a man who had learned to fly under Mitchell's direct influence. Lieutenant General Henry Arnold, who in 1942 commanded the entire Army Air Forces. Arnold had been there at the beginning. He had known Mitchell personally, trained in the doctrine Mitchell had argued for, watched the court-martial from inside an institution he understood well enough to survive it, while Mitchell did not. In the years that followed Mitchell's resignation, Arnold had moved carefully, absorbing what Mitchell had demonstrated, building on it without inheriting the disciplinary wreckage that had accompanied it. He had been a student, and he had been a prudent one. By 1942, Arnold commanded the air forces of the most powerful industrial nation on Earth, fighting a war on 2 oceans. He later described Mitchell as the father of American air power. The description was accurate, which is why it was said after the war rather than during the court-martial. The institution moved with characteristic timing. In 1946, Congress awarded Mitchell a posthumous Congressional Gold Medal. He had been dead for 10 years. The citation acknowledged his contributions to American air power and his prediction of the Pearl Harbor attack. In 1947, the United States Air Force was established as an independent branch of the American military, separate from the Army, with its own command structure, its own doctrine, its own budget. This was the specific institutional goal Mitchell had been court-martialed for demanding in 1925. It arrived 21 years after his resignation and 11 years after his death, built on the ruins of the case the War Department had spent a decade assembling against him. The Congressional Gold Medal and the Independent Air Force arrived in consecutive years, which is the kind of timing that doesn't require editorial comment. Douglas MacArthur commanded American forces in the Pacific from 1942 until 1951. He accepted the Japanese surrender on the deck of USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on September 2, 1945. In his memoir, Reminiscences, he wrote about the Mitchell court-martial with the discomfort he had described at the time. Genuine, documented, and insufficient to change his vote. He did not, in any public forum after the war, address his role at the court-martial at length. He did not explain what he had decided in the room about the relative weight of his discomfort and the verdict he reached anyway. The silence is its own kind of record. What Mitchell's doctrine produced by the end of the war is easier to measure than what his silence cost in the years between. American air superiority over the English Channel on June 6, 1944, was established enough that the Luftwaffe could not mount a sustained defense of the beaches. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs held the air. The men who crossed in those landing craft did so in daylight, under a sky that was not equally contested. They could not have known, the soldiers who survived those beaches, that the air cover above them traced back through the World War II air campaign to Arnold's command, through Arnold to Mitchell's doctrine, through Mitchell's doctrine to a classified report filed in Washington in 1924 by a general who spent the next 2 years being court-martialed, and the 10 years after that being a civilian. No name, if the name isn't documented. One consequence, because the consequence is real. Some of those men walked off the beach. They were alive in part because an institution had eventually built what one of its own officers had told it to build. 18 years late, through a catastrophe, at a cost Mitchell had spent his career trying to prevent. Here is the full accounting, assembled plainly. Mitchell submitted his analysis in 1924. The institution filed it. He was court-martialed in 1925 for saying publicly what the filing cabinet contained privately. He resigned in February of 1926. He died in January of 1936. Pearl Harbor happened in December of 1941. The B-25 named for him flew over Tokyo in April of 1942. The posthumous medal arrived in 1946. The Air Force he had demanded was established in 1947. The people who prosecuted him lived to see every item on that list. The man who wrote the 324 pages did not live to see any of them. What the institution built on his doctrine was real and consequential and won a war. What it returned to the man himself was a filing cabinet and a posthumous medal and a bomber named after him that flew over the city he had predicted would attack America. After America had been attacked, after he was gone, after the evidence had been sitting in a room in Washington for 17 years, waiting for someone to remember it was there. The institution counted his insubordination. Mitchell counted the years. One count ended in a courtroom in December of 1925, 13 votes to 1. The other ended on a Sunday morning in Hawaii at 6 minutes before 8 o'clock, with 353 aircraft crossing the northern coast of Oahu in 2 waves. Both counts were accurate. Only one of them built the Air Force that won the war. The other one just decided who got credit for it. If Mitchell's 1924 report had landed on the right desk, does December 7th still happen the same way? Leave it in the comments. I read every one.